Hi, my name is Stephanie, and today I want to talk to you about autism and decision making. Thank you for all your video suggestions and for the YouTube channel members for voting on those. This video idea was meant to be more on the concept of major life decisions with autism. However, I felt it would probably be best to just kind of go over decision making in general and also include that as a part of it. So when it comes to decision making in general, autistic people report more difficulties than non-autistic individuals. Autobiographical accounts describe how decision-making processes can become locked up and overloaded with pictures coming in all at once, and how making a decision on the spot can be very hard for children with ASCs. Such accounts are consistent with teacher observations of delays in decision-making by children with Asperger's syndrome and parental perceptions of indecisiveness in young adults with AS. Even when it comes down to simple, everyday types of decisions, autistic people tend to report more difficulty in these than non-autistic people, as shown in this chart. When to go to bed, we have a 6.26 in the autism group and an 8.60 in the control group. Note that 1 would be extremely difficult and 10 would be not difficult at all. When to wake up, a 6.4 with autistic group, 7.89 with the control group. What clothes to wear, 6.17 in the autism group, 8.03 in the control group. What to eat, 4.83 in the autism group and 6.43 in the control group. When to shower, 6.61 in autism group, 8.93 in control. What and when to take medications, 7.08 in autism group, 8.78 in control group. When to pay bills, 5.94 in autism group, 7.25 in control group, and making and keeping medical appointments, 5.9 in autism group and 6.99 in the control group. I do wonder if the pretty significant low 4 number for the choosing what to eat has to do with food selectivity for some of these autistic individuals who replied. So I don't know, maybe if you were interested in hearing about food selectivity, you can go ahead and check that out in this video. The previous source continues to go into overall findings in regard to autism and decision making. Compared with neurotypical individuals, intellectually able people with ASCs experience greater difficulty with decision making. Decision making in ASCs was associated with anxiety, exhaustion, problems engaging in the process, and a tendency to avoid decision making. These findings are consistent with previous autobiographical accounts and known features of the condition. The reports of exhaustion are consistent with the finding that people with ASCs demonstrate reduced reliance on a heuristic normally used to reduce the cognitive demands of decision making. Such difficulties in foreseeing consequences, remembering information, and staying focused on the decision are consistent with known impairments in executive functions in this condition. So basically what they're saying in these findings is that autistic people do have more difficulties in the decision-making process, and it's very likely because of the way our brains are wired differently. For autistic individuals, decision-making is associated with anxiety, exhaustion, problems engaging with decision-making in general, and just straight up avoiding making decisions. I did find it quite interesting that they found that autistic people tend not to rely on a heuristic as much as non-autistic individuals. A heuristic technique, or a heuristic, is any approach to problem solving or self-discovery that employs a practical method that is not guaranteed to be optimal, perfect, or rational, but is nevertheless sufficient for reaching an immediate short-term goal or approximation. Now, this is a clear issue with autistic individuals if you think about it. We tend to like things to be accurate, structured, pretty much perfectly correct and thorough, and the concept of taking basically a mental shortcut for a quick approximation that might not be the best option just to suffice for the moment, quite frankly, goes against our very nature. I, for one, absolutely hate making approximations, especially with numbers. Specifically, I don't know why, but approximations are not my thing. I do not like them. I like to be able to give an informed opinion with all the information. I don't like relying on simple things to make those snap decisions, and I suck at making quick decisions. So it could be very much because we do not take as many mental shortcuts as other people do, which sometimes means that even though we're slower, we might be, you know, a lot more accurate. However, that can be a problem when we're suddenly very stuck on something that isn't super important, like what do we want to eat, and you have like 2 minutes to decide. Like it's not the end of the world, but it kind of can feel that way because we need all the information, and when we don't have it, it's just it doesn't work out. It's not, no. Now, there was another study that once again was supportive of the concept of autistic people taking longer or having more difficulties with decision making. They had autistic individuals and a control group basically take some tests that measured the decision making capabilities of the people taking those tests. This source confirms, again, even though we are slower at decision making, we tend to have better accuracy. Compared to controls, the participants with ASD demonstrated slower decision making and superior performance on the Iowa gambling task. When those taking medications, which I think were for anxiety or depression, were excluded, participants with ASD also sampled more information. There were no other differences between the groups. These processing tendencies may contribute to the difficulties self-reported in some contexts. However, the results also highlight strengths in ASD, such as a more logical approach to and care in decision making. So another thing to note about autistic decision making is that we tend to be consistent, which is, you know, it seems kind of obvious with our tendency towards repetitive behaviors and consistent behaviors. Anyway, this next study kind of looked into decision making specifically in risk taking and gambling and found the following. Autistic people were more consistent in their individual choices from trial to trial. Furthermore, the proportion of participants who either implemented an invariant response strategy, either always choosing the most risky or most safe option, was significantly higher in the ASD group compared with the controls. Additionally, while the ASD group were slower to make their responses in the win frame and the first half of the lose frame, by the end of the task, their decision times were the same as the typically developed controls. These findings suggest that the ASD tendency towards repetitive behavior may demonstrate itself even in high-level decision-making tasks. So this goes to show that we have that tendency to make slower, more deliberate, more careful decisions, and we also tend to be quite consistent with those decisions. I did find it interesting that they were talking about how by the end of those tasks in the test or whatever, that the autistic individuals had become quicker in their responses that were basically the same speed as the control group. And this was basically because they were just going off of their consistency before. This is more of a personal note, but I kind of feel like a lot of times autistic people tend to trust their own thinking process over that of others because we know that we took everything into consideration. Whereas, again, non-autistic people do take mental shortcuts a lot of the times, and while that often works well for them, we end up maybe taking longer, but we're often a lot more accurate. So by the time we've established a line of thinking with the things that we need to take into consideration, now we're on the similar task over and over, we're going to maybe make those same decisions and be repetitive in our behaviors and our decision making. Again, that's kind of more on a personal note, but they did notice, again, with the consistency, then that finally led to being able to make those decisions at the same rate, but also, again, in a repetitive way. Some suggest that autistic people make decisions without really taking into account the emotional aspect of things, or maybe not being affected by emotionally charged choices and presentations, and they cite alexithymia or interoception deficits as a reason for this. Now, if you have no idea what those words mean, I do have videos on those things, so you can go ahead and check those out if you're interested in learning more. One study set out to find the differences in autistic responses versus non-autistic but alexithymic responses to emotionally framed questions, or choices basically. So the abstract here explains pretty well like what their aim was, how they did it, and what they found. So I am going to share that with you now. The way choices are framed influences decision making. These framing effects emerge through the integration of emotional responses into decision making under uncertainty. It was previously reported that susceptibility to the framing effect was reduced in individuals with autism spectrum disorder, ASD, due to a reduced tendency to incorporate emotional information into the decision-making process. However, recent research indicates that, where observed, emotional processing impairments in ASD may be due to co-occurring alexithymia. Alexithymia is thought to arise due to impaired interoception, the ability to perceive the internal state of one's body, raising the possibility that emotional signals are not perceived and thus not integrated into decision-making in those with alexithymia, and that, therefore, reduced framing effects in ASD are a product of co-occurring alexithymia rather than ASD per se. Accordingly, the present study compared framing effects in autistic individuals with neurotypical controls matched for alexithymia. Results showed a marked deviation between groups. The framing effect was, in line with previous data, significantly smaller in autistic individuals, and there was no relationship between alexithymia or interoception and decision-making in the ASD group. In the neurotypical group, however, the size of the framing effect was associated with alexithymia and interoception, even after controlling for autistic traits. These results demonstrate that although framing effects are associated with interoception and alexithymia in the neurotypical population, emotional and interoceptive signals have less impact upon the decision-making process in ASD. So basically, this study found that alexithymia and interoception does play a role in decision-making in neurotypical people or non-autistic people with alexithymia. However, alexithymia did not have an effect in decision-making in those with autism. Based off this information, they conclude that it's actually ASD alone that is causing emotional things to be maybe less involved in the decision-making process than it is in those who are not autistic. However, this doesn't mean that we aren't at all affected by emotional framing, or even sometimes that we aren't similarly affected by this. Another study found the following. High-functioning adults on the autism spectrum were no less responsive to highly emotional outcome frames as were the non-autistic controls. This result seems to contradict psychophysiological evidence, skin conductance response, from DeMartino et al. Of 2008, that persons on the spectrum are relatively insensitive to contextual frame. It may in fact be a sign that high-functioning adults on the spectrum have learned to overcome some of their inherent tendencies. Now, obviously, while this isn't conclusive, this research does show that basically we do have a tendency as autistic individuals to be more rational in our decision making, although we can still be affected by highly emotionally charged framing just as much as a non-autistic individual. Now, whether this is just a natural thing or a product of us overcoming our natural tendencies, as it was stated, is up for debate. So we've established through these research sources that autistic people tend to stick with that consistency and avoidance of change even in decision making, find the whole decision making process quite unpleasant, are very thorough, and desire to have basically all that information there so they can go through it all instead of taking basically mental shortcuts for approximations, and are in some ways less affected by decisions or choices that they need to make even when they are framed in a highly emotional, basically manipulative manner. I think that all of these things can really point to why major life decisions aren't exactly something that autistic people find something they want to deal with, that they might avoid a lot. Obviously, everybody has trouble with major life decisions because that's why they're called major life decisions, right? They're affecting your life majorly. But when even little changes affect an autistic person in big ways, imagine trying to make a decision that literally changes almost everything about your life. Even if it's simple as moving from one city to another, there are so many things that are going to change because of that. That is a decision that, quite frankly, it is not not natural for an autistic person to want to pursue. There are so many things that change because of that. Now, there is one other thing that I do believe affects this, and it's something called episodic future thinking, which is basically being able to imagine the future. As predicted, the ASD group performed less well than the typically developed group on both temporal directions of the AI, remembering past events, episodic memory, and imagining new events, episodic future thinking. While the reduced ability to remember past events is consistent with established findings of episodic memory deficits in individuals with ASD, evidence of impairment in the ability of this group to imagine the future is of particular importance given the limited literature addressing this issue. Of 4 studies conducted to date investigating episodic future thinking in ASD, this is the 3rd to find impaired performance in this clinical group. And this emerging consistency suggests future thinking may be considered an area of characteristic impairment associated with the disorder and may be a reasonable candidate to explain some of the behavioral symptoms. For example, difficulties with episodic future thinking might be expected to contribute to the core feature of behavioral inflexibility. Now remember that impairment does not mean unable to. We are able to remember things, and we are to some degree able to imagine future events, just maybe not as well as typically developing individuals. So when we live life in sometimes what can be considered a bit of a rigid manner, with things being consistent, things being the same, repetitive decision making and actions, and the difficulty with imagining what the future looks like or what events would look like in the future, it's pretty clear why autistic people would have serious problems with major life decisions. So let's take going to college for an example. For roughly 12 years of an autistic person's life, they've done things in a pretty predictable manner. You go through the same school year, your classes are mostly decided for you, you know your requirements, you have specific times of the year how things are done. A lot of times your parents are taking care of the enrollment because a lot of times they have to be able to like sign off on things and everything. You have a lot of these things that are structured in a way, and then you just go up to the next grade and you do the same year again. And you know, these things are very structured in that you don't have a lot of room for your own pathway decision making until you get to like high school, and then things can be a little bit different, but there's still a lot of structure there where, you know, the times of things are, and you still have the enrollment periods of the same thing, and they also understand how to like guide you through the graduation process. But when deciding to go to college, there are so many variables to consider. There's just like, everything is so different. You know, there's not an automatic like, oh yeah, well next year we just enroll into this thing. You have to enroll into every single individual class, where that's not what you ever did the last 12 years, at least in the American system. Your parents are not handling any of this for you anymore because they're not supposed to. Now you're the adult and you're the one signature who's supposed to be, you know, signing on that paper. All of a sudden, all of this stuff shifts and changes, and it costs money, and you have to make certain marks to be able to get into certain other things. And really that's a lot. That's a lot for anybody, but it's a big issue for autistic individuals. And that's not even mentioning the barriers some people face when it comes to the supports that end at adulthood for some, and things that don't necessarily carry into college that they used to have required in school 12th and under. Now, non-autistic people might go into college because that's, you know, the next step that they're supposed to do. You know, they might enroll in general ed classes while they're trying to figure out what they want to major in. They might test the waters and roll in a class here and a class there, see if they like it, and then maybe switch over to this major, declare a major here, and etc. Like, that's quite a common story in college. A lot of people are going for the experience because that's what they want. And, you know, of course, there are also people who know exactly what they want and they know their major from the beginning. But if they don't know, it's not that big of a deal. They just, you know, knock out some general eds, mess around with some stuff, test the waters, see what they want to do. that flies in the face of how autistic people work. We want to know what's going on. We want to know why we are where we are, why we're doing what we're doing. We want things to be structured, and so the idea of just going into this crazy different world to just take some classes because we haven't decided everything yet, just the level of uncertainty is anxiety inducing just to think about. So a lot of times this can lead to autistic people not enrolling purely because they don't know what they want to do, and unlike their non-autistic peers, they're not exactly willing to just, you know, skedaddle through some general ed classes and test the waters. That's just not how they do things. Now, the issue of autism in college is a whole thing on its own, and I'm sure I'll go over it in a video one of these days. But basically what I'm trying to say is the levels of uncertainty in these types of decisions are very big barriers for autistic people, as we've seen in the way that we make decisions. So now that we've looked at a lot of how autistic people make decisions and how this isn't necessarily always the nicest process for us, and sometimes we can be a bit slower at this process, however, more thorough, more accurate, I wanted to include some things that could possibly help someone if you are trying to support someone who is going through the decision-making process and you want to help reduce overwhelm and, you know, all the unpleasant things that can come for an autistic person with decision-making. And this was provided in one of the studies that I've already mentioned before in the video. It may be useful to A, provide additional time to reach a choice, B, minimize irrelevant information, C, present closed questions, D, offer encouragement and reassurance, and E, address general issues around anxiety. I'm irritated at myself because I didn't catch the source and also can't seem to find it within the many tabs I had open researching for this video, but I did read in one of these areas that very likely is actually in one of these sources, but I'm not 100%. There was a note about the behaviors of autistic people in one of the many studies that they were talking about, where basically it looked to be that at a certain point, faced with maybe failure as a result of the decisions and maybe like risk-taking assessments and stuff, that there actually would be a deviation in choice because the autistic person was more driven by the anxiety of failing and the desire to not fail, the fear of failure, than they were of, you know, the reward of success or whatever. And so I think these tips are really important to encourage someone and help them even manage the anxiety that is very common in autism, because someone frantically making decisions because they don't want to fail instead of being kind of in control of it and making decisions because they want to succeed, that's kind of heartbreaking. It does definitely remind me of the whole ABA thing. Thank you so much for watching. As always, the resources, references, etc. further reading are in the description box, linked or cited depending on what source it was, so feel free to check those out for yourself. I hope that you enjoyed this video or found it useful. If you did, go ahead and give it a thumbs up and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy autism related content from me, you can go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I upload to this channel every Thursday at 4 p.m. Central Standard Time. Thank you to everyone who supports me here on YouTube as YouTube members, my patrons over on Patreon, and a special thank you to my Spaz Tier patron, Marie Johansson. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful week, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!